Good morning. It's still morning. Today is January 21st, and this is the Ways and Means Committee. And today we have a fiscal briefing, and we have David Romans with us from DLS. Please come forward. And we have Teresa Tazinski with DLS as well, and I will turn it over to the both of you. And after the briefing, we'll open it up for questions, if that's okay. Welcome.
Thank you. I think we're trying to get the document up.
Okay. While we're waiting, I'll just say, committee, after the briefing, I do have a couple of announcements, so just hold tight. And we do have bill hearings at 1 p.m.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm also joined by Kate Hayward, who's going to keep the document moving on the screen. If you look at page 1 of our quick look part of the fiscal briefing, it shows that the budget overall grows by about $800 million to $67 billion, a 1% growth. State general funds actually declined by $274 million, or 1%, to about $27 billion. That decline in general funds reflects a lot of cost containment in the budget, is the primary reason for that. Some key points about the budget. It's balanced on a cash basis with $106 million fund balance at the end of fiscal 26. It leaves $2 billion, a little more than $2 billion in the state's rainy day fund, which is about 8% of general fund revenues. The Spending Affordability Committee had a goal of structural balance for fiscal 26, meaning that ongoing revenues cover all of your ongoing costs. The governor failed to meet that goal. He's $186 million out of structural balance. In the 40-plus years the Spending Affordability Committee has existed, the General Assembly has met the spending goal in all but 1 year. So this would mean the General Assembly would need to take additional actions to make ongoing cuts or identify additional ongoing revenues to supplement what the governor has proposed. The governor is proposing a Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act, which has about $3 billion of actions in it. Page 2 hits the highlights of those actions. So these are the actions the governor needs to change statute to do. There's other budget cuts he can just do in the budget bill itself, but these are statutory changes. And so you can see the biggest chunk of actions is revenue adjustments, $1.3 billion of additional general fund revenues. $691 million of that is from the personal income tax reform proposal. I will talk about that more in a couple of pages. You skip down a line, there's also a capital gains surcharge being added to the personal income tax that would generate about $128 million. And that's a 4-year proposal. The other changes are permanent. In terms of sports wagering, the governor is increasing the tax rate from 15% to 30%, sending the money to the general fund for fiscal 25, 26, and 27, and then to the blueprint fund for the long term. Doing the same thing with table games, raising that tax rate from 20 to 25%, temporarily sending the additional revenue to the general fund, and then sending it to the blueprint fund. In terms of transfers to the general fund, about $630 million. The biggest item is transferring $230 million from the state's local income tax reserve fund. This is a perennial place the state has borrowed money from during difficult budget times. And there is a repayment plan in the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act to repay it over 10 years, beginning in fiscal 29. Then the other large chunk of actions is about $1 billion of spending reductions. The single largest item is a little over $400 million from the state's rainy day fund. There was a required appropriation of some of the surplus from fiscal 24. The governor's supposed to appropriate it into the rainy day fund. He's proposing not to do that. As I said, you still would have over $2 billion in the rainy day fund with this cut. Governor is also proposing a permanent increase in the Medicaid hospital deficit assessment. He's raising it by $100 million on an annual basis. This is essentially an extra charge on hospital rates in the state. Most of it is covered by the payers. A small amount is eaten by the hospitals. It saves the general fund money because the revenues from that deficit assessment support Medicaid costs. A significant shift of cost to local governments, K through 12 teacher retirement. So under current law, the local governments are responsible for the normal pension costs for the year. So that's the contributing for all of their employees for that year of service. And then the state covers any unfunded liability related to the teacher's retirement system. So you get an unfunded liability if our investment returns are below the actuarial expectations, or if teacher salaries grow faster than the actuarial expectations, things like that. The unfunded liability amount grows by more than 180 million in fiscal 26. So the governor is proposing that the locals cover half of the growth. So about $93 million. And that is a permanent change. So what I mean by that is from the future, the locals will pay the normal cost, whatever that is, plus $93 million in every year under the governor's plan. And that's a cost that will be borne by local governments, not by the LEA. Skip down a couple of items. There's a no retirement reinvestment cut, about $44 million. Since the state did pension reform about 15 years ago, we've reinvested some of the savings from pension reform into sort of accelerating the return of our pension system to a kind of an appropriate funding status. The governor is proposing to stop making that extra payment. Currently, the pension system is about 73% funded. It's generally believed states should try to be at least 80% funded. So we'll slow down our return to the 80% status. There's a number of other cuts there. I'm not going to go through them all. There's the full fiscal briefing. You've got pages and pages of all the cuts in the BRFAs. Many of them are $3 and $4 million items. Turning to page 3, kind of big picture for a minute. This looks at the general fund structural budget outlook for fiscal 26 through fiscal 30. The blue bar, blue dotted lines, is what we were estimating in December when we briefed the Spending Affordability Committee. You can see a structural gap of $2.5 billion for 26, growing to $6 billion by 2030. The governor's proposal makes, as you can see, substantial progress. The orange bars reflect the governor's proposal, so almost eliminating the fiscal 26 deficit, but missing the spending affordability goal, and then making significant progress in the out years. But it's important to note that even with the governor's plan, as we walk through it, you still have a significant challenge beginning in fiscal 28. Those are very sizable gaps in the out years. A substantial portion, and I'll show you a chart later on this, of those gaps in 28 through 30 is because the Blueprint Fund will not have enough money to cover all the Blueprint implementation costs, and then the general fund has to start putting money in to fully fund the Blueprint implementation. And that is a major driver of the structural gap. Page 4, the pie chart there is looking at, so how did the governor balance the budget versus the deficit that was projected in December? December, we projected a $400 million deficit in the current year, $3 billion for fiscal 26. The governor has erased it through a somewhat symmetrical plan here, about 40% through spending reductions, about 40% through revenue actions, and 20% through transfers. Page 5 tries to show you what's different on the spending side from what we forecasted in December to what the governor actually did. So the negative bars are where the cuts were. We talked about the BRFA items, which total $1 billion already. There's 3 notable policy areas where there are cuts in this budget. Childcare. The state's childcare subsidy program has grown dramatically. Since 3 years ago, we had about 22,000 children in the program. We were forecasting in December that we would have over 50,000 children participating in the program in fiscal 26. The administration is proposing a cap on participation at about 42,000 children in fiscal 26. So nearly 10,000 fewer than we were forecasting would be enrolling in the program. Second area of cuts is public higher education versus our expectation in December is 137 million less across the different public four-year institutions and Baltimore City Community College. The most notable cut is in the university system in Maryland. They are getting, in actual dollars, 105 million or so less in fiscal 26 than they did in fiscal 25. Third area where there's less money in the budget than we expected is the Developmental Disabilities Administration. There is an enormous deficit in the current fiscal year in DDA for their community services program. They were budgeted to spend $1 billion of state general funds. The deficit is about 450 million, so it's almost 45% shortfall in that program. So the governor is proposing 97 million of cost containment for the current year and over $200 million of general fund cost containment in fiscal 26. A few of those items are BRFA items. Most of it are things that he was able to just do in the budget bill himself. So those are the major policy areas that get less money. You see on the far right-hand side, there's more money for Medicaid, which is just differences in assumptions from us. And then there's an initiative and enhancement number of $187 million. I break that out in a little more detail on page 6. I'm not going to go through this line by line. I would say about 2/3 of this list is economic development. One of the focuses in the governor's budget plan is to try to stimulate economic growth in the state, as we've had a relatively stagnant growth in recent years. So these are kind of where the enhancements are. All right, let's shift gears and talk about revenues for a minute. Page 7 provides a more detailed outline of the proposed income tax changes that the governor's making. So one of the bigger changes is to the tax brackets, and you can see they're laid out there in the middle of the chart. The yellow signifies the brackets that are different than current law. You can see at the bottom part of the brackets, the governor is standardizing and having just one rate for those first 4 brackets of 4.7%. You'll note, if you look at the single filers, that the bracket of the 4.7% is slightly lower than the current rate for income between $3,000 and $100,000. So the governor talked about people getting a tax cut as a result of this plan. This is part of the reason for the tax cut, is that slight lowering of the rate for certain income. The other change in the brackets is at the high end, adding 2 new brackets, a 6.25% bracket for individual filers with income over $500,000 and a 6.5% bracket for those individual filers over $1 million. And you can see similar adjustments for the joint filers. On top of those changes, there are a number of other changes the governor proposes. He's saying for people with Maryland taxable income that's more than $350,000, whether you're a single filer or a joint filer, that you will pay a 1% surcharge on capital gains income. That part of the tax plan is for 4 years. It's the only temporary part of his proposed tax changes. So a 4-year capital gains surcharge. His estimate is that it will generate about $128 million a year. If you look in the governor's highlights book, he is saying that that money is what he's using to fund his economic development, economic stimulus proposal. Other changes include doubling the standard deduction to $5,600 for an individual filer, $11,200 for a joint filer. Eliminating the option to itemize. So in tax year 2022, about 23% of Maryland tax filers itemized on the state tax return. They would no longer be able to do so. So for those people, that will likely mean for many of them, they pay a little bit more in taxes because they'll have more taxable income. The reverse is for some of the lower income people, that higher standard deduction amount may actually reduce their taxable income sum, so it may help contribute to them paying a little bit less. Final change I'm going to note is there's a child tax credit in state law that you have to have income of $15,000 or less to qualify for. Then if you have income less than that, you get a $500 credit for each child under the age of 6, and a credit for each disabled child under 17. What the governor's doing is changing the phase out. Right now, if your income is $1 above that $15,000, you lose the whole credit. He's saying let's phase it down with your income up to $25,000. So those are the personal income tax changes. If you turn to page 8, provide a full list of all of the tax and revenue proposals and what the fiscal impact by year is expected to be. We've color-coded this so that the revenue numbers in black are going to the general fund, the blue goes to the blueprint fund, the green goes to the transportation trust fund, and the red is to various special funds. All right, so I've talked about the income tax and the sports wagering. About 6 lines down, we get to the corporate income tax. Governor's proposing 2 changes. One is to institute combined reporting in Maryland, and you can see the expected revenues in the administration plan from that. The other is to reduce the corporate income tax rate from 8.25% to 7.99%. Starting in fiscal 28, it would be phased down over 2 years. Another significant change is related to death taxes. You see a $0 impact. What the governor is proposing to do is to eliminate the state inheritance tax and offset the lost revenue from that, which for the general fund is in the $70 million range, by lowering the state tax exemption from $5 million to $2 million. In the transportation side, if you total up the numbers, it generates about $470 million for the Transportation Trust Fund in fiscal 26 and about $420 million in subsequent years. The biggest change there is having a retail delivery fee of 75 cents per order. The order has to be subject to the sales tax. So if your retail delivery fee is just a mail order prescription, you're not paying the fee. If you're ordering from Amazon and you order 12 things and they send you 6 boxes, you're just paying the 75 cents once. It's per order, not per number of packages you get. So that's the biggest transportation revenue. The other notable transportation change is to limit the trade-in allowance on vehicle purchases to purchases that are valued at $15,000 or less. MDOT has estimated that 40% of all purchases are $15,000 or less. I understand there's some controversy about that number, so I'm sure you'll hear more about that. So those are the tax and fee proposals. They total about $1.4 billion of revenue in fiscal 26 and about similar levels in the subsequent years. There's some other revenue proposals in the administration plan. One, they just assume that the Federal Tax Cut and Jobs Act is extended as is, which adds $300 million to the state's revenue estimate. They are suspending the state's revenue volatility cap, which helps protect us from volatility in capital gains and other non-withholding income for a few years, which frees up some money to spend. And then there's a variety of smaller actions. Turning to page 9, just hit some highlights here. K through 12 education. Budget grows $551 million for education aid to local school systems. It's a 6% growth. There are, however, some interesting cost containment proposals related to the Blueprint Fund. The first is the behavioral health element of the Blueprint Fund, which is called the Consortium on Coordinated Community Supports. The mandate in state laws for $130 million a year. Governor wants to change that to $40 million, permanent change. Second change is that starting in fiscal 26, the state's foundation amount grows each year to phase in a teacher collaborative time amount. The governor is proposing to delay that by 4 years. That saves $124 million in fiscal 26 for the Blueprint Fund. And it would save about $500 million in fiscal 29 for the Blueprint Fund. I showed you in the revenue chart, there's some revenues that will go to the Blueprint Fund that help support it in the out years. The other major cost containment proposal relates to the concentration of poverty program. It is fully funded per statute in fiscal 26, but for fiscal 27 and fiscal 28, the governor wants to freeze the growth in that program, so pausing the growth for 2 years. That would generate about $70 million of savings in fiscal 27 for the Blueprint Fund and $193 million in fiscal 28, and in slightly larger amounts in subsequent years. There's also a number of new programs being proposed through the Blueprint Fund that will be in legislation that will be before you, including some changes to the Grow Your Own Educators Grant Program that was enacted last session, and they're funding it at a substantially larger amount, $33 million. Last year was, I think, it was under $10 million was the fiscal note. They're also creating an academic excellence fund with $19 million that would fund literacy and math counseling for students who need it, and providing a $9 million program demonstration grant for collaborative time. Bottom of page 9, in the health area, one note, healthcare provider rates are growing by about 1% in the budget. A couple of other highlights on page 10. State employees will get a raise in this budget, $180 million to provide a 1% cost of living increase and to fund the usual employee increments or merit increases, if you will. The budget plan shifts $144 million of costs from the state to local governments. The biggest piece of that is the teacher's retirement I already talked about, but there are some other shifts also proposed in the budget. So locals would have to pay $144 million more in costs. Last thing I will note, for those who care about the capital budget, the governor in his capital budget included $50 million for the legislature to allocate for whatever initiatives the General Assembly so chooses. So there's a placeholder there. Page 11 just hits on some other potential legislative issues. Key issues obviously are sustainability of the budget. Second key issue is what is going to happen at the federal level. The state's revenue estimates and the whole budget plan, it does make no assumptions about cuts to the federal workforce, which obviously could harm the Maryland economy. They make no assumptions about cuts to aid to state governments, which again, if there's some sort of change in the way Medicaid is funded, that could have a significant impact on the federal money that passes through the state budget. So that's the risk to sort of the budget outlook that I've shown you, is that we don't know exactly what Congress and the president will do. Last thing I want to mention on this page is in 2023, the General Assembly passed a Child Victims Act. This eliminated the statute of limitations for people who were victimized as youth in state facilities. And it caps the state's liability at $890,000 per occurrence of some sort of abuse. To date, about 3,500 people have come forward with claims against the state, almost entirely related to time they spent in juvenile services facilities. Some of these claims go back as far as the 1960s. The potential liability is, in the billions. The Attorney General's office has hired outside counsel that has experience with these types of cases to help advise them, and they are negotiating with plaintiffs' counsel, trying to reach some sort of settlement to keep this from going to court. I have no news on any settlement or what it might entail, but there is some belief they might have a settlement agreement before the end of session, at which point they will come back to the General Assembly, and if there's a first year of payment that needs to be made in, say, fiscal 26, they may be asking you to find the money to make that payment, which could easily be in the hundreds of millions of dollars range. Really no way to say exactly what that would be. So that's kind of the one big thing that's not in the budget that might end up being in the budget before you're all done. All right, two more charts I'm going to talk about. Page 12 shows the health of the Blueprint Fund under the governor's plan. So the bars add up to the implementation costs of the Blueprint program each year. The different colors represent where the money is coming from. The blue bars are the money that comes from the ongoing revenues that go to the Blueprint Fund. The green bars are the fund balance that the Blueprint Fund is built up that gets spent as needed to supplement the ongoing Blueprint revenues. And you can see through fiscal 27, the Blueprint Fund has enough money to cover all of the implementation costs. In fiscal 28, the Blueprint Fund has used up all its fund balance and doesn't have enough money to cover all those costs. And the yellow bar shows you the kind of unfunded amount that we're assuming the general fund would have to pick up. And as I said earlier, this is a significant contributor to that structural gap I showed you starting in fiscal 28 and building in fiscal 30. All right, the last chart I'm going to show you, and I am hardly the expert on this, but we did some sample families and tried to illustrate for you what the tax proposal's impact would be on those families. So there's 6 sample families. You can see what the filing status is for those families, what their adjusted gross income is. We assume the first 4 scenarios, they take the standard deduction currently, and the households 5 and 6 are itemizers currently. So you can see there's differential impacts on the state income tax with the lower income households seeing a modest reduction in their state tax rate and also in their local income tax is paid. The higher income households who lose itemization and have to pay those higher brackets and are also impacted by the capital gains surcharge are likely to pay, quite a bit more. So anyway, that gives you sort of an initial illustration for just a handful of sample households what the impact looks like. Madam Chair, I'm going to turn it over to Teresa Tazinski to just talk through a little bit about the Maryland economy and revenue outlook, and then we'll be done. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. So I'm going to start on page 14. which is a table giving you a snapshot of the Maryland economy in calendar 2024. And it's doing so by looking at income, both total personal income, which is, and also wage and salary income. Wage and salary income is a component, the largest component of total personal income. And also the two columns on the far right are gross domestic product. That's a broad measure of economic activity in the state. This data is reported in dollars, and so for each of these, I have not only shown you the growth rate in nominal terms, but also adjusted for inflation. The data is available quarterly, and we have data through the third quarter of 2024. So on the far left column, you can see the quarters, January through March, April through June, and July through September. And what we're showing you here is the year-over-year percent change. So January through March of 2024 compared to January through March of 2023. In the middle of the table, we combine the first three quarters together to give you a year-to-date growth rate. So this is January through September of 2024 compared to January through September of 2023. In Maryland, personal income in the first 9 months of 2024 was up 5.8%. Wage income was up a little bit faster at 6.2%, and the economy as a whole grew 5.3%. We've also shown you what the growth rate is for the U.S. as a whole over the same time period, and you can see Maryland has been tracking the U.S. economy very closely in 2024, even growing a little bit faster when it comes to total personal income and wage and salary income. Now, of course, inflation has been elevated in recent years, although it has come down. U.S. Consumer Price Index measure of inflation was 3% in calendar 2024. That's down from 4.1% in calendar 2023 and 8% in calendar 2022. So adjusted for inflation, you can see that personal income was up 2.7% year to date in 2024. That's through September. And wage income was up 3.1%. To put that in some context, in 2023, in calendar 2023, inflation-adjusted wage income in Maryland had been up just 1.1%. So the 3.1% we experienced in the first 9 months of 2024 is a significant improvement. The last couple rows of this table take a longer-term view, comparing that first 9 months of 2024, not to 2023, but to 2019. 2019, of course, being the last year before the pandemic began. So it's the January 2024 for each of these measures in January through September in 2024 compared to January through September of 2019. Of note, Maryland has experienced growth over this time period. If you look at inflation-adjusted gross domestic product, the very last column on the right, we have seen growth of 7.4% over this 5-year period. If you look at the 5 years before the pandemic, so 2019 versus 2014, Maryland's growth in inflation-adjusted gross domestic product was up 8.7%. But this time when we compare Maryland to the U.S., you can see that across all three measures, Maryland's growth has significantly trailed the U.S. in terms of both income and the state's economic growth. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, we also have shown you here on this chart, Virginia. Virginia, both in comparing 24 to 23, has outpaced the U.S. and therefore Maryland. And also in this longer term view, Virginia continues that same pattern where they're growing faster than the U.S. economy as a whole. If we turn to the next page, I think overall you could say the Maryland economy has done well in 2024, as far as we know. I will say all that data is subject to revision. It has pretty healthy income growth and a pretty healthy economic growth. But one of the main risk factors, of course, as Dave mentioned at the beginning, relates to the federal government. And this series of bullet points on page 15 just gives you some background on the federal government in Maryland and its importance to the economy. There are about 160,000 federal civilian employee jobs located in Maryland. That includes about 12,000 that are in the U.S. Postal Service. It does not include civilian workers at the National Security Agency because that agency is classified. The number of people who work there is also classified. For the most part, the big pieces of our federal workforce, a lot of it's related to the Department of Defense, as well as the various service branches, the Navy, the Army, the Air Force. There's also about 40,000 people at the Health and Human Services Department. Most of those are at NIH and the Food and Drug Administration. There's another about 13,000 people who work for the Department of Commerce in the state. Of course, it's not only about direct jobs located in Maryland, because we know a lot of Marylanders commute to federal jobs in the district and in Virginia. And both the district and Virginia themselves have about 190,000 civilian federal jobs. To get a picture of that total pot of federal workers, not just people who are here in the state, but who also commute. The Comptroller's Office used Tax Year 2021 data to look at every taxpayer who had a federal W-2 when they filed that year. So that's everybody who has gotten wage income from the federal government filing in Maryland. And what they found was that 256,000 taxpayers had received a federal W-2, and that represented about 8% of all taxpayers. They had about $24 billion of federal wages, and that accounted for about 12% of wages reported in federal adjusted gross income for Maryland residents in tax year 2021. So if you do a rough back-of-the-envelope calculation by applying an effective tax rate, that $24 billion of wages equates to about $1 billion of state personal income tax and about a little over $700 million of local income tax. The federal government, though, is also important to the private sector, because so far we've just been talking about federal employees, but the federal government spends a lot of money on contracts, and that goes to private sector companies in the state. In federal fiscal year 2023, that amounted to about $42 billion of contract spending for work performed in Maryland, and that is roughly equivalent to about 10% of private sector gross state product in Maryland. And then, as Dave also mentioned, the state budget itself is vulnerable to cuts from federal spending. There's about $20 billion of federal funds in the fiscal 2026 allowance. We can turn now to revenues. And we're going to start with the fiscal 2024 closeout. Fiscal 24 ended last June, and this chart is comparing the actual revenues to the estimate at the time, and also comparing fiscal 2024 actual revenues to fiscal 2023. In total, general fund revenues exceeded the estimate by $217 million and grew 5%. But if we adjust for a variety of one-time items, ongoing revenue growth was just 1%. The personal income tax is far and away the largest source of general fund revenues, and it was actually slightly below the estimate by $80 million. We under-attained on income tax withholding from people's paychecks, as well as quarterly estimated payments, but we did get a little bit more payments with returns than we had expected. Overall, the general fund personal income tax grew 1.1% in fiscal 2024. The corporate income tax exceeded the estimate by $131 million and grew 4.8%. There was an increase in the share of corporate income tax going to the Transportation Trust Fund between these 2 years, and that affects the general fund growth rate. Total gross receipts were up 8.2% in fiscal 2024. That's the 6th consecutive year of growth for corporate gross receipts. Refunds were up 10%, but they do remain low by historical standards. The sales tax, which is the second largest general fund revenue source, was down slightly below the estimate by $13 million. It fell 1.8%. This is due in part to an increase in the share of the sales tax going to the Blueprint Fund. It was 9.2% in fiscal 23, and it rose to 11% in fiscal 2024. If we look at total sales tax gross receipts, they were up just 0.8% in fiscal 24 over fiscal 23. Keep in mind, however, fiscal 24 is the first year of the cannabis sales tax. And so if we take that out to have a more of an apples-to-apples comparison between the 2 years, we find that gross receipts of the sales tax actually fell 0.2% in fiscal 2024. Cannabis revenues did exceed expectations by about $28 million, and about $12 million of that flowed to the general fund. Among the other revenue sources, there was substantial overattainment in interest earnings, as well as the insurance premium tax. We got some extra revenue in the miscellaneous, mostly due to one-time items in the unclaimed property. But we had underattainment for the alcohol and tobacco taxes, as well as the estate and the inheritance taxes. If we turn now to page 17 in the last revenue chart, we'll look at the forecast for fiscal 2025 and fiscal 2026. The Board of Revenue Estimates had done a new forecast back in September, and then they updated that forecast in December. And what this chart is showing you is that December forecast relative to their September forecast for both fiscal 2025 and fiscal 2026. In total, the Board of Revenue Estimates revised up the fiscal 2025 general fund estimate by $194 million. They're expecting growth of 1.6% over fiscal 24. That's 2.2% ongoing. The great majority of the upward revision comes from the personal income tax. We've had sort of a rebound in withholding, and that was performing better than expected. I will say, for the most part, all of the changes here just relate to aligning the estimate to the year-to-date performance. The underlying economic outlook that the BRE relied on has not really changed from September to December. There were small adjustments to the corporate income tax and the sales tax and the insurance premium tax, but there was a significant downward revision to the tobacco tax, which has been underperforming. In fiscal 2026, there is a technical adjustment that added $24 million to the general fund. This relates to pushing out by 1 year the first year that they're going to need debt service for the redevelopment of the Camden Yards Baseball Stadium in Baltimore. You'll also notice there's a substantial decline in tobacco tax revenues in fiscal 2026 of 19%. This relates to an increase in the share of the tobacco tax going to the Blueprint Fund. You may recall that in the BRFA last year, a new distribution of tobacco tax revenues was created for the Blueprint along with a tax increase. That amount of that distribution was fixed at $88 million in fiscal 2025. But in fiscal 26, it goes to 32.6% of revenues. So it's going to go from 88 million in 25 to about 140 million in 2026, and that accounts for some of the decline in the general fund. There also is declining sales, so the revenue itself is declining anyway. But you'll notice in terms of the 2026 numbers, they did not revise the personal income tax, even though they revised it in 2025, nor did they revise the sales tax. And they did this deliberately because of that uncertainty hanging over the Maryland economy. As Dave mentioned, the baseline forecast here makes no assumption whatsoever about what will happen with the federal workforce or federal spending and how it might impact the Maryland economy. But that is obviously a risk factor. And so to be prudent, the Board of Revenue Estimates left alone their estimates for the two major revenue sources from the general fund, the personal income tax and the sales tax, as something of a hedge against potential problems that may, slow down the Maryland economy going forward. And that concludes my section, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you. That was a lot of information. We know you guys are kind of doing a show to all the committees and probably could say this in your sleep by now, so we appreciate it. It is a lot of information for us to take in. We do have a few questions. I'm going to start with just a couple of questions, and then I'll turn it over to committee members. So first, I was wondering if in this packet, is there a similar chart? There's a chart on page 12 for the estimated Blueprint cost and funding sources, so we can kind of see when that goes off the cliff, which is in 2028. Is there a similar chart for Medicaid or the DDA spending that's in here?
No, I mean, the general fund, the non-Blueprint part of the structural gap that we talk about in the out years is about $700 million a year. So that's the combination of everything else that's going on. So setting aside Blueprint, the state still has an ongoing problem between revenues and spending on the non-K through 12 education part of the budget.
Okay, so it's fair to say, though, that the Blueprint right now, we have paid for Blueprint. The issue is in 2028 is when we start to see the problem.
Correct.
Okay, bless you, Delegate Long. I want to jump to the income tax proposed changes by the governor. Do we know how many people are going to be affected by those changes, what jurisdictions they live in? Do we know that information?
We do not. The administration didn't provide us much detail, and we are just starting to do our own, we're getting the data to do our own forecasts and estimates. We certainly are interested in all those questions you just asked and others as well. But we're not ready to present that yet. Could you let the committee know, I'm curious, what are the most used itemized deductions, if you know? I mean, is it like mortgages, charitable deductions? Do we know, do we have that information?
Off the top of my head, I don't know the levels. I'm guessing it would be mostly related to mortgage and property taxes.
Okay.
you cannot, at the federal level, you can itemize your state and local income tax up to $10,000, but obviously you can't do that on the state's, on the state return. So what's left is property taxes, mortgage interest, and charitable donations. The exact magnitude of those, I would have to look up.
Okay. Just a couple more questions. So shifting to corporate income tax, if you can you just briefly elaborate on how the change in the proposed corporate income tax, well, let me say it this way. Can you talk about pass-through entities and how the proposed tax bracket change would affect pass-through entities like an S corporation or other entities where small businesses basically pass that income on through their own, but they use that income to run their businesses? Are those numbers reflected in the information here in terms of the folks that will be affected in that upper bracket where the taxes are going up?
I think they should be, and we literally have one number from the administration on what the revenue impact of this is, so we don't have anything broken out or delineated beyond the total personal income tax number.
Okay. So I'll move on to the committee, and we'll start with the vice chair.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you, David and the team, for this really insightful briefing. I wanted to pick up and underscore a point that the chair mentioned. I heard you say, I think, David, that Mr. Romans, that the blueprint right now is covered for this fiscal year and the next. Is that correct? So is there an urgent need this legislative session for cuts to the blueprint?
I'm not going to say whether there's an urgent need or not. I would say that if you were looking for why is the governor doing this now, I would say that the reason is if you don't do what he's doing now and get savings that build up over multiple years, you'd see much, much larger on the chart on the screen right now, much larger yellow bars, like $1 billion more in fiscal 29. So I think it's really a question of, at some point, the state has to figure out how it's going to pay for those out years of the blueprint. We can certainly not deal with it at all right now, but that will make those out years even more challenging. So it's really, just a timing of when we want to take on the challenge of funding it.
Sure, but to make sure that our listening audience and the committee understands, currently we have the funds for the blueprint this fiscal year and next fiscal year. Is that correct?
Yes, for fiscal 26 and 27, the blueprint fund has enough money to cover the implementation costs.
Perfect, thank you. I wanted to unpack and focus in on the concentration of poverty grant and that cut, halt, pause, whatever it is that we'd like to call it. Can you share a little bit more about what the concentration of poverty grant is and the types of students that it serves?
Yeah, I'll do my best. The concentration of poverty grants are designed to go directly to schools with high percentages of students who are in poverty. I can't remember what percentage we're at, but I think it's right now is around 60% or more of the students in a school are in poverty, then that school qualifies for extra grants on a per pupil basis that help support, the services delivered in that school. So, that's the intent of the program, is to target more dollars to disadvantaged students.
So are these the schools in places that have our highest concentration of poverty, so our poorest students in the entire state?
Yes.
And what is the governor proposing then to do with those funds that would go to our students that are the poorest in the entire state?
He saves the money so it extends how much, it keeps more money in the blueprint fund to help pay for some of those out year costs, those fiscal 28, 29 costs.
But does it halt the funding for those community schools? Because when we're talking about the concentration of poverty grant, we're talking about community schools, correct?
Yes.
Which were created in the blueprint to provide funding for our poorest schools so that wraparound services such as mental health, such as behavioral health, extra learning time, and all of those things could be provided. So when we talk about the concentration of poverty grant, what I'm trying to unpack is that concentration of poverty.
So I guess to be clear, so what it does, so right now, if you're a school that qualifies for it to be a concentration of poverty grant school, the per pupil amount gets phased up over a period of years. And what the governor's proposal would do is halt that school at whatever per pupil amount it's at in fiscal 26. They would stay at that level for 27 and 28, rather than continuing to see that per pupil amount grow as they phase up to the maximum per pupil amount. So schools will still get concentration of poverty grants. It's not all going away for the 2 years, but they will not get the growth that under current law they would receive.
So the funds that our schools that have the highest level of poverty were expecting, which were supposed to be increasing, and again, these are schools that are extremely high need. Those funds that we put in the blueprint that they expected for wraparound services, that increase in funds, that would be halted under this budget.
Right, so they'll get less funding than they would have otherwise gotten in fiscal 27 and 28.
Thank you. Just pushing on this a little bit more, and I know that you are the budget person, not necessarily all the blueprint policies, so let me know if I am taking this beyond where you can share. But my understanding of the community schools and the concentration of poverty grant is that we have the personnel funding, where we've put money into having actual staffing in these schools. We've also put money into per pupil funding, so that based on the concentration of poverty and number of students, that there is sort of an appropriate amount of funding for these community schools to provide the wraparound services that we talked about. So when we are referring to these wraparound services and the halt in funds, these schools are responsible for creating needs-based assessments for their communities around what is needed, right? Is mental health needed? What are the other types of services, food, are there things that our students need to learn? So what is the impact if those schools are doing all of these need-based work, figuring out what the needs are in their schools, and we halt the funds that they were expecting? I'm trying to just reconcile how the schools would actually implement the plans that they have already developed.
Yeah, as you alluded to, I am not an expert on the nitty-gritty of the implementation of the blueprint. I mean, I like to say they would receive essentially the same level of funding as they are in the current year. So they would certainly probably not be able to make as much progress as they plan to, but they wouldn't like lose money. So they wouldn't have to go backwards per se, but they would definitely limit their ability to, do any sort of additional services or expand.
So it would limit the ability to expand services for our highest poverty schools potentially.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So we had an issue with the mic committee. Press your buttons again. I have been keeping a list, but if you have a question, go ahead and press your button again. Delegate Ebersol.
Thank you, Madam Chair. All right, well, following up just briefly, because I didn't have it, but the Vice Chair asked a question about concentration of poverty grants and freezing the amount of money per pupil, but probably also no new community schools could open up if we froze this, right?
I'm not sure if the bill has actually been introduced. I think there is going to have to be a close look at how the exact wording of the bill is on that question.
Thanks. So let's move on to collaborative time and the savings there. 60-40 split where we up the collaborative time for teachers from 20% to 40%. And there's a delay on that, and we quote $124 million in savings. Where do we see that savings occurring? In other words, same question, I don't have to rephrase it. Where's that savings coming from?
So the primary way the collaborative time was funded in statute is that the foundation amount, which is kind of the base amount for the school systems, was supposed to grow by certain dollar amounts in fiscal 26 and each of the next few years to phase in the funding for collaborative time. So the cut first reduces the foundation amount. So there's less money in the foundation program than there would have otherwise been without the cut. But then a number of the other Formula Aid programs build off of the foundation. So compensatory education, English language learners, those build off of whatever the foundation amount is. So a lower foundation amount means less money flowing through those parts of the formula as well. And all those things add up to the 124 million. So it's less foundation money, less compensatory ed, less English language learners, and so forth.
And that money would revert, if we saved it, that money would revert to the Blueprint Fund then?
Exactly, it would stay in the Blueprint Fund.
Directly, okay. Moving on, if I may, Madam Chair, just have a couple. We talked about pension liability payments being pushed over to counties, 97.7 million, nearly $100 million. How's that divided up? I mean, is it, in other words, this is not for every county. Obviously, we have 24 jurisdictions that are going to have to manage this. Is it done by population, or is it done, I mean, I have a couple of superintendents calling me about this.
I believe I think the actual allocation is by like the number of teachers in the different school systems.
Okay, that's good enough. I mean, just to get a general sense of it, the number of teachers that are in the school, that were in the school system that are now in the pension program, or is it current?
No, I think it's current teachers.
Okay, thanks, because they have to make their contributions there. Okay, turning to gambling briefly, if I might. We talked about the governor suggesting increasing the percentages at table games and at VLTs. You said temporarily. Is that because this would be a BRFA item for us?
No, sorry, I might have misspoken. So I meant temporarily in the sense that the increased revenue from the change in the tax rate goes to the general fund temporarily. It goes to the general fund for fiscal 25, current year, fiscal 26, and fiscal 27, and then it goes to the Blueprint Fund forevermore.
Thank you for clarifying that. Was there any analysis done that increasing the tax rate might reduce their actual sales, or do we base it on current sales rates?
Again, these are administration proposals. I don't know what analysis they did. We haven't done our own independent analysis. We will be doing that when we do the fiscal note.
Okay.
Just to clarify it, the tax rate on VLTs does not go up.
I'm sorry.
Table
games. Table games and sports wagering.
Sports wagering, sorry, I misspoke, and thank you for setting me straight on that. But in both cases then, there could be an argument that if we increase the rates, they'll have a little more problems competing with, well, illegal people who do these sorts of things. Okay, but thank you. I appreciate the answer. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I just want to just add just to the earlier question about teacher retirement. If you're looking at the actual fiscal briefing online, page 60 breaks out by county the actual cut to teachers retirement. There's two columns that you would care about. Teachers retirement is the K through 12 part, and then there's a community college retirement line that adds to about 4.8 million.
Thank you. I hadn't gotten to page 60 yet. I appreciate that very much.
Delegate Hartman.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for being here today with the presentation. So a few questions, just for clarification. The 75-cent delivery, that's on taxable items. So would food be included in that, like the food services?
No, if you ordered something that was groceries and it was only non-taxable things, you would not pay the 75 cents.
Like fast food, if I had McDonald's delivered through, whatever, so would that be taxed?
I'd have to look at the bill. I'm not sure on the food delivery.
Generally speaking, restaurant is subject to, food service is subject to
so that
sales
would be
tax.
okay. Thank you. The trade-in allowance. There's a lot of you said there's different interpretations. So you're saying that it would be limited to purchase of $15,000 or less. So if you're purchasing a $15,000 vehicle, I guess you'd probably be trading in a $2,000 or $3,000 vehicle. If you're trading in a $40,000 vehicle to buy a higher priced vehicle, would there be a $15,000 cap on the? No. So only if you're buying a car for $15,000 or less.
Correct. Those are the only people who would get any benefit from a trade-in allowance.
Wow, and that's subject to legislation, correct?
Yes,
so
absolutely. So
that's just what the governor is suggesting.
Yes, it's in the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act, that proposal.
Okay, going to the capital gains, the 350 in excess of 350,000. If you have ordinary income of 290 and 70,000 of capital gains, you're over that 350 income. So is that capital gains going to get hit, or is it only for if I sell an investment that's large enough to have a $350,000 gain in 1 year?
No, it's if your taxable income is over 350,000, period. So in the example you gave, that person would pay the surcharge on the full 70,000 of capital gains.
Okay, so that's kind of worded incorrectly then in what you have here, correct? Because it says surcharge on capital gains in excess of 350,000.
Yeah, it's a little ambiguous, I would agree, the way we worded it.
So that is if your income,
Yeah.
so whatever goes over 350, just that portion over 350 is hit, or it triggers the whole thing?
No, so it's your personal income from all the sources that you have your taxable income. If it hits 350,000, whether you're a single filer or a joint filer, that means that you are eligible to pay the surcharge on your capital gains. And then you would take your capital gains income, whatever that is, and you'd pay the 1%
Put the
surcharge
1%
on
on
that.
it. Okay. Are we hearing from the nonprofits as far as if we eliminate that itemization? I mean, are they going to need additional funding because the incentive to give obviously is gone? Not that you only give because of the tax write-off, but some people give because it will take them to a different, class of tax or whatever, and there's reason behind it, so.
I mean, I think you all will hear from the different groups that are unhappy about this before I will, so.
That's well said. I think my last question, and it's scary when I'm thinking along the same lines as Delegate Ebersol. I had to, he's not even here for that. So the delay in collaboration time.
Yeah.
So you're saying the 60-40 will become 80-20. What is it right now? Where are we right now for teachers?
Right now, conceptually, it's 80% of the time is in the classroom. The idea was to reduce the time in the classroom to provide more collaborative time, going from 80 to 60. And again, that was being phased in over a multi-year period.
So you're saying all teachers right now across the state should only be teaching 80% of their day?
I'm not saying that every teacher is. I'm saying that was the concept of how this was structured. I think it would depend on the school system and the teacher and so forth.
Okay, so the state funding, though, is based on that principle?
Yes.
To the county?
Yes.
And then the counties negotiate, I guess, through the contract individually? There's no bearing from the state as to?
Right. And the state, there's no requirement in state law that you have to teach 80% of your time in the classroom. And that's just was, I think, what they found when they were doing the blueprint.
Okay, and you said page 60 has the breakdown county to county of that 92.9 million?
Yes, and some of the other shifts to the
bear.
local governments, yep.
Okay, I think that covers it. Thank you.
Delegate Griffith.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for being here. I appreciate it. Just a couple questions. And my first question is around the estates and trusts and the inheritance proposals. The first part of that is, so the Register of Wills, about $30 million of the total revenue comes from the inheritance tax. So eliminating that puts them at a huge deficit. Is there anything in the governor's budget that addresses that piece?
We do not believe so. I think that was an oversight in the budget.
Okay, very good, thank you. And then the next part is, in the fiscal 2028, local governments are facing a big shortfall for local road revenues as the provision that we've created as General Assembly sunsets. Is there anything in the budget long-term, or is there an assumption in that the General Assembly would revisit that in 28? What does the budget suggest with that?
Yeah, the budget assumes current law.
Okay.
So it assumes that would be that fall off in 28.
So, because that could be hundreds of millions of dollars to local governments lost if that's not renewed. That's not factored in whatsoever. Okay. So if the General Assembly decides to hold the counties harmless, that funding isn't currently accounted for in the plan at all, correct?
Right.
Okay.
So there would be a trade-off. I mean, obviously the administration is using the transportation revenues they've identified to support, various state projects. And if you were to extend the money for the locals, that would just mean less for the state project.
And then the very final question, and thank you, Madam Chair, is tied to follow up on Delegate Harvard's question on the delivery tax. So we just passed legislation a couple of years ago taxing digital services. So there's already a tax we've implemented on these deliveries. And basically we're going back and taxing some of these same services a second time. And this you might not be the right person to answer this question, but is there any questions with the double taxation on this, or that's not your?
I'm going to suggest that the councils to this committee have more tax knowledge than I do, so you should work with your staff.
No, I appreciate the briefing. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Delegate Fair.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you so much for the analysis and the discussion. I just wanted to cut in quickly on the blueprint funding slide one last time. And the ongoing revenues, I noticed there's a substantial drop-off in the growth of the ongoing revenues over the years, and it continues to drop off and get lower and lower, the increase that we see. Looking at the primary funders of those ongoing revenues, what do they, are you aware of what they're forecasting is the problem with the drop-off and the increase in rate of those revenues?
Yeah, I mean, so a number of the revenue sources are pretty mature and stable, so they're not growing very much. The other thing that happened is last session, I think it's for 2 years, the General Assembly sent some of a certain percentage of tobacco revenues to the Blueprint Fund. But that was a temporary solution, so it boosts their ongoing revenues for a couple of years, but then it goes.
It doesn't go away, it goes down.
Goes down, okay.
So it's going to be, the tobacco tax, which was a fixed amount in fiscal '25, becomes 32.6% in '26. I think it goes up slightly or stays at 32.6 in '27, and then it goes down to 16%. And keep in mind, the tobacco tax is a declining revenue source. It's not only not growing much, it's falling, and will continue to fall because people are not smoking as much. So it's not going to produce growth for the blueprint going forward.
Gotcha. And does this ongoing revenue account for the governor's suggestions for increasing, for example, the sports wagering tax? And does that account for all of that? And are there opportunities that the General Assembly should be considering of ways of increasing just simply that ongoing revenue stream to increase the amount that's in that side so that we're not dipping into the general fund?
Well, I think if the General Assembly wants to fully fund the blueprint, at some point you're going to have to decide whether either you're okay with general funds supporting it or need to identify some additional revenues for the fund. I'd leave it to you all to decide what the appropriate actions are.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Delegate Plakovich-Carr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the briefing. I actually don't have a question. I just have a request piggybacking off of the chair's, one of her questions at the top here. Will it be possible for DLS, as you are doing the evaluations and digging in further on the data on the proposed changes on the individual income taxes and itemized deductions, to also provide a county-by-county breakout, given that there would be impacts to the county revenues as well?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Delegate Feldmark.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for this briefing, and I'm going to thank you in advance for taking questions offline, but I'm just going to ask a few of my long list here. So starting on page 8, the revenue that we're getting from eliminating the revenue volatility cap, can you just speak to that a little bit more? And the 3 years showing in that outlook, is that essentially using up what is available, or can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure, Teresa can jump in. She's equally or more knowledgeable. But so a few years back, the state enacted legislation to do what we call the revenue volatility adjustments. So we look at non-withholding income tax as a percentage of the revenue estimate. If it's above the 10-year average, so if it's unusually high, and a big piece of this is capital gains, which tends to fluctuate a lot. So if it's unusually high, they set aside a small portion of the revenue estimate to sort of protect us against being overly reliant on capital gains and other more volatile revenues. So each year we calculate what the amount that should be set aside is, and the amounts that you see there on page 8 were the BRE's estimates of what the amount that should be set aside for each 26, 27, and 28. I think they didn't have a number for 29 and 30. They thought we were within the 10-year average those years. So the administration is proposing to suspend that volatility provision for 4 years and would reinstate it in 2030.
Okay.
Just to be clear, it's not set aside in some kind of a fund. It's just a deduction off of the revenue forecast, so that the revenue, general fund revenues that the budget is built on are lower by these amounts. Not that the money's been taken and put somewhere. It's just reduced the revenue that you're building a budget to.
Got it. Thank you.
If I may, I just wanted to make one observation. The governor's plan, whatever you think of the tax plan, does make our revenues more volatile because we've got a capital gains surcharge, so more reliance on the capital gains. And those new higher brackets, again, are hitting people with a lot more capital gains and other volatile income. So it is sort of interesting to get rid of the revenue volatility at the same time that we're getting more dependent on volatile revenue sources.
Okay, thank you. And then, again, just to, I guess, add to the request for additional detail on the itemization of deductions, I guess I'm curious to get just a really full analysis of who itemizes, how much they itemize, and the nature of the deductions, which we discussed earlier. And specifically, sort of with the doubling of the standard deduction, how many of those itemizers are sort of buffered by that or protected by that, and how many would actually be impacted by the elimination. And then my final question for now is on the personal income bracket changes. You had a few families as examples, which was very helpful. But I guess what I'm wondering is, have you identified or can you identify sort of the tipping point in terms of at what individual income or, for a joint filer, what the tipping point is from seeing a stable taxation rate to actually increasing when we look at sort of the combined effect of all segments of that income. Does the question make sense?
Yes,
Okay.
I understand the question. We have not endeavored at this point to do that analysis, and we can certainly think that through. It's obviously complicated because, people can have the same taxable income, but some of them are using standard deduction, some are using itemization, and so
Right,
forth. So,
right.
But we'll think about that.
To make it easier, we could just say assuming the standard deduction.
Good. All right.
Thank you.
I'll just like point out on the itemized deductions, we already have had a significant drop in the number of people who itemize, and that's because of the federal law.
Right.
So the federal 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act substantially increased the federal standard deduction. And if you making it much advantageous for many people to take the standard deduction at the federal level. And if you do that, you cannot itemize on Maryland. So there's already been so the people left itemizing are people for whom they can still itemize at the federal level. And it tends to be higher income people who benefit from still itemizing despite the increase in the federal standard deduction.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Delegate Hornberger.
And thank you for that in-depth briefing. My question comes down more to the projections, and when we leave here, when we leave session, we pass a balanced budget, right? It's supposed to be fiscally sound. However, we come back the next year and we're seeing a reoccurrence now of $200 to $300 million deficit based on that balanced budget. My question is, does this sort of reoccurring behavior impact our bond rating or the way that we're viewed by bond rating agencies?
So I think the bond rating agencies tend to, take a longer view, if you will. So I think they're less concerned about, you were a few $100 million out of balance in the current year and you needed to take some actions to do it. They often cite two things. They're concerned about our structural outlook because they want to make sure we can pay for what we're planning to do. And they often praise the state for processes like the Board of Public Works being able to make cuts during the year, so that if we get into trouble in the middle of a year, and this is, in fact, the governor went to the Board of Public Works in July and made cuts to help try to ease the current year problem. So they like that process because Maryland can react quickly to a budget problem that pops up, whereas in other states, they have to wait until the General Assembly comes back into session to take any action. So I think they're not too concerned because of our processes that are in place about the short term, but it's that longer term structural gap that one of the rating agencies put us on watch for potential downgrade because they're concerned about our out-year outlook.
Yeah, I also know that, they looked fondly on, states having the ability or the will to raise revenue to cover those gaps. And then the follow-on question, if I may, refers to the rainy day fund. Are they also reviewing that and how much money we have set aside, and are we at a healthy level for the rainy day fund with these projections?
For many, many years, the state's goal was to be at 5% of revenues in the rainy day fund. Over the kind of post-pandemic period, we had quite a bit of one-time revenue come along and let us bolster the rainy day fund up to about 10%, which is, I think, pretty much the gold standard around the country is be at 10%. So the administration's proposal has us at 8%, which is still far healthier than we often have been when we've had the AAA rating. So I don't think being at 8% would be seen as a negative. I think it's a positive that we're above that 5%.
Great, thanks so much.
Delegate Young.
There it is. Thank you, Madam Chair. Two quick questions, one of which is doubling down on the questions that you've heard pertaining to different business types and the pass-through entities. But I have a friend that's watching, and they wanted to just a little more clarity. What are the types of businesses that are going to be paying more as a result of the changes under the higher income tax brackets?
Pass-through entities pay the personal income tax. They're affected by that. Sure. And it would just depend on the income of the business. If the business and the pass-through income puts you in those brackets as an individual, then you would pay those higher rates. If your business and the business income that you generate through that pass-through rate puts you in other brackets, then you'd pay those rates.
To clarify, I think the question more speaks to, can you list the type of businesses just expressly? So is it just LLCs, S-corps? What else are there?
Those are all pass-through entities. Yes.
What else do we have? Just so it's on the record. Can you just list the types, the other types for the record is what is being asked? So
you're right. It's LLCs, it's S corporations, partnerships, those sorts of, everything that's not an if the business is incorporated, then it's a corporate income tax and it pays the corporate income tax. And everything else is basically a pass-through entity. A sole proprietorship would be kind of another category. But again, it's all dependent on, they pay the same rates as somebody who only would have wage income, except they also have the business income.
Sure, they just want to get on the record. I appreciate it.
Yeah,
the question I have, though, goes back to also a statement that you made pertaining to the Child Victims Act. You specifically referenced that it's not in the budget, and I understand that. The question is, though, the number of occurrences you mentioned. I think it was 890, you said, per occurrence. My question is the definition of occurrence. An occurrence can be each and every time there was a violation. It could be one person, and that is the occurrence. Under this estimate or under your foreshadowing, how are y'all looking at that definition?
So statute is ambiguous on what an occurrence is. So I think this is part of the negotiation that's going on.
Let me jump in real quick. When you say the negotiation on the settlement, is that I'm not familiar with the actual case very clearly. Is it a class action that's happening, or is it just like one? My understanding is each person could bring a case. So can you clarify that?
People can bring their own case. There are, if you listen to on the radio very often, you'll hear ads all the time.
Yeah.
With law firms looking for clients, and I understand that there's a handful of firms that are consolidating most of these cases, most of the 3,500 cases. So again, the statute isn't clear on the number of occurrence, how to define occurrence, so I can't really speak to.
That's clear. Thank you so much.
Delegate Miller.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for being here for the briefing. I'll just a couple clarifying questions, and then I can meet offline with any other ones. But the blueprint on the chart on page 12, is that already have the governor's proposed cuts and changes figured into that chart?
It does.
Okay. All right. And then as far as the pension goes, when you were talking about the 93 million being shared back with the locals, is that taking into account also the governor's changes to the career ladder and things like that with the pension costs and what the impact of pension costs will be, particularly in the future?
Again, this is just the unfunded liability costs that the state was supposed to bear this year, so it really doesn't have any relationship to other things going on with the blueprint. It's just how much the actuaries are requiring we put into the pension system.
Because as each year, it's going to grow, as obviously salaries go, things like that, and as the changes to the blueprint go. So is there an actuarial chart that reflects those changes and how far we are from the 80% and how far in the future that we will get as it goes like this?
So, I mean, the pensions is complicated. So there's the normal cost, which is paying this year for the future retirement costs of all the teachers who worked this year. And that's what the locals are paying. And that will change over time as teacher salaries go up, the normal cost goes up because their future retirement benefit will be larger because their salary is larger. So that is a cost that the local governments will bear over time as that normal cost changes. The unfunded liability is driven by a number of factors, but the easiest one to explain is we're supposed to get an investment return of a little over 6% a year. If our investment return as a state is below that, then we have an unfunded liability. And that's what drives up the unfunded liability part of the cost that the state has to pay. And that's the piece that we're asking the locals to pick up, this 92 million of costs. You can reduce your unfunded liability by having a great investment year too. You get a year where investment returns are 15% and the unfunded liability goes down quite a bit. So it will, gyrate some depending on particularly investment returns.
Okay. And then with the behavioral health consortium, with it going from 130 million to 40 million, will all of those contracts that are either just now being awarded with this latest round and the previous round, will all of those contracts be done by the time this next budget year? Are they all accounted for?
Yeah, I think most of the awards were made through the end of the current fiscal year.
Okay.
So I believe that they're in the process of starting to work on the awards process for the upcoming fiscal year. So that obviously they'll have to adjust the amount based on how much the General Assembly appropriates.
Okay, and then was there any discussion in the governor's part about some of the equity issues around that? Or is that up to the consortium?
Yeah, I've heard no explanation. I haven't really heard an explanation for how they chose the number they chose even. So.
Okay, thank you. And then the last part is on page 60 where you talked about non-public placements. Was that in relationship to retirement? Or was that in relationship to a cost share of non-public placements in general?
It's, so one of the governor's proposals is to shift 25 million this year and another 25 million next year of non-public placement costs from the state to the local school systems.
And that will go directly to the local school systems?
Yes, the school systems, this is an educational cost. The counties pick up, and the counties in Baltimore City pick up the retirement costs. The non-public placement cost is an educational cost that would fall to the school system.
Okay, thank you very much.
Delegate Wu.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to follow up with the same question some other delegates asked earlier about the change of tax code. I want to see, for example, how many people will be impacted by county that somebody proposed that earlier. Can we get a number for how people will be impacted differently at each legislative district? You can do it, right?
So all the questions you all are asking on revenues, we have the same questions, and this is very helpful, and my next meeting today is about what data we need, so I appreciate all the input. I do not think that we can do it by legislative district. I think we will be able to provide county-level data. I think that's probably the best that we can do. I'm not sure that even the controller's office would have the information by county level, by district.
So for each resident, we know where they're living, is that right? So once we know they're living, we know which legislative district they're residing. I think personally I feel that's kind of pretty easy job to just disaggregate that and get the summary of that.
Again, the controller's office has all the income tax data. I do not know that I've never seen income tax data compiled at a legislative district level. I suspect it is difficult enough getting some of the kinds of information you're asking for. I don't think it's likely that we're going to be able to provide you information by legislative district. We can inquire, but I would be very surprised.
I really appreciate that. I think the other point, we will have a lot of revenue bills come to our committee. I really hope you will have similar tables, right? How they impact different county or district, and create a table like that. That would be helpful for us to understand the impact. And one example, for example, if I look at $1,000, we need to pay tax. I just feel like the administrative burden to get that $1,000 tax probably outweigh the work the State Department put it there, right?
So one thing to understand about the income tax brackets is that tax bracket is your first $1,000 of income. For some people, that might be their only income. But for people who are making $100,000, they still pay that, whatever that rate is, on their first 1,000. So like it's a graduated rate. So as your income gets higher, you pay each step through the brackets, if you will. So almost anyone with taxable income is paying that rate for the first $1,000.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I would love to see those kind of data, disaggregated data, and then look at that. Another point is about page 18, about the growth part. If I compare Maryland and then the whole country and Virginia, we are probably substantially lower in terms of growth. So from your analysis, like where, for example, the state, the country grows 33%, and we only grow at 8.5%, and Virginia 34%, and we only 9.4%. And those kind of numbers, I just wonder, we are like substantially lower. What's the big reason for that? Because if we're not growing the pie big enough, we always face this dilemma right now. It's not just next year. If the economy goes bad, unfortunately, it may happen. Then the situation we're facing even worse than we're facing now. So what's the main reasons through your analysis we're get a situation like that we're having now?
I would say it's not clear exactly why we have trailed, especially Virginia, which is a much more comparable state, although it's a much bigger state than Maryland, to comparing us to the U.S. And I would say it's actually at this point I don't know exactly why we have slower growth. We do have slower population growth than Virginia as well, so some of it may just be they're growing more people, they're getting more people. We have a sizable outflow of people every year. People who lived here who move. Some of those are retirees who move to Florida or someplace. But so that may be one factor. It's a difficult question to know exactly why. Virginia is similarly situated. They too are at high risk for cutbacks to the federal workforce and federal spending. So they face that same risk as we do. So because answer that question sometimes can be very political, right? So I thought. Sometimes we have other departments come to us, say, okay, it's the economy side. Is DOS actually work on this kind of issue, like analyze this kind of issue as well? About? Like economy side, like why we're growing slower than others? We do a variety of comparisons with other states, but getting into the answering that question of why, is a lot more difficult than simply, looking at how, it's a complex, economies are complex, and there's a complex, interaction of the private sector and the public sector, and it's a, it's just a difficult thing to tease out exactly what's driving the level of growth that we have seen. But we have, we've been slow to come out of the pandemic, for sure, but we have caught up. I mean, if you look at the more short-term period from just last year, we are right at the U.S. growth rate. And it may just be we have lagged for whatever reason and have now picked up growth and are now matching, the sort of U.S. growth that we have seen. Whether that would continue going forward, we don't know for sure, obviously. But that is a very encouraging sign that we are not trailing the U.S. in the more recent period. And we're trailing Virginia a little bit, but not by a lot. So.
Thank you. The third question is about the DDA policy change, right? And do we know how many people actually get impacted by that change of the service? Is there a way we can get some number there?
Yeah, I mean, we need to, there's a lot of different components to the cost containment. A lot of it is going to impact the providers and how much they're reimbursed for the services they provide. Other components impact the people who choose to have self-directed care, where they kind of control their money and decide who to pay and how to do it. We're gathering more information on the details of that, and we'll certainly have more information later in session that hopefully addresses your question.
Okay, I heard a lot of really concerns about this change, right? So next time if you come to us, I probably ask the same question on this.
Okay.
Thank you.
And for our last question, Delegate Miracu North.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you again for staying strong. You've answered a lot of questions with a lot of thoroughness. So I have one quick request and then a quick question. The first request regarding the taxes is a follow-up to Delegate Felmark's point about the sample families that you provide on page 13. I noticed the assumptions included each household includes 2 dependent children younger than 13. Is it possible to get data to include households that take care of elderly or dependents? I think that's a factor that I know I'm hearing a lot of concerns from constituents regarding taking care of multiple generations of folks. If there's any data on how this can impact them, that would be great. My second question is regarding, you mentioned a point, I think it was Delegate Wilkins to ask the question. You answered, building up savings now is one of the reasons probably why a lot of the proposed blueprint funding would be on pause. Is that the same rationale for the child care subsidies? Despite it being very popular, I'm still baffled as to why that's even proposed. So is that the same rationale? It's a savings measure?
So I'm going to back up and say one more thing on the teacher, and then I'll answer your child care. I think one of the things the governor has said on why they did some of the blueprint, particularly the collaborative time, is the teachers, there aren't enough teachers to do the collaborative time. So I think that was that's another part of the rationale for that piece. That doesn't speak to concentration of poverty, but it speaks to that piece being delayed. And one of the things you will see in the governor's budget, and I mentioned some of these little new blueprint programs, if you will, but there are some smaller amounts for, marketing to teachers, to paying moving costs for teachers who move from other states to Maryland. So there's sort of some effort to improve that teacher, the number of teachers in Maryland, which maybe makes it easier to implement the collaborative time. So I just wanted to add that to that answer. I think childcare, it's more about the program has seen really pretty amazing growth in recent years. Like I said, I think it was 2022, 2023, we had about 22,000 children. Now we're over 40,000 children in the program today. So a huge jump in demand for the program, partly because we've allowed slightly higher income people than were eligible before to participate. So I think they're just feeling like it's not sustainable. Again, I don't want to speak for the administration, but I think it's not so much about saving money for the future as it is how sustainable is the trajectory we're on, where enrollment is growing. As I think I mentioned earlier, our projection was more than 50,000 children would participate this year if there was no cap on enrollment. So there's a lot of demand, and I don't know what the right balance there is.
Right, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much both for being here. We appreciate it. That concludes the briefing. We still have, it will be very brief, folks, 1 p.m. bill hearing, so please be on time. They will be very quick. Thank you.